Right. So, yeah, as Cindy said, I'm an intuitive energy healer. I am a teacher and trainer of energy healing with the School of Intuition and Healing. And it's been an interesting journey to get here. And some of you might have heard some of my previous talks where I explain how this path unfolded for me. But talking about past lives and reincarnation is not something that I expected to be doing early on in my life. You know, I grew up in a Catholic family, and this sort of topic was not discussed at our dinner table. But as life progressed, I started getting interested in other subjects. And, you know, in my early 20s, I started reading some interesting books. And one of those books was Many Lives, Many Masters by Dr. Brian Weiss. And in that book, he kind of speaks about one of his clients that came to him for hypnotherapy. And he calls the client Catherine, and he's trying to help her with some of her phobias and her fears. And after a few sessions, she kind of just all of a sudden starts describing a previous incarnation. And Dr. Weiss is very surprised by this, but obviously doesn't say anything and doesn't really know what to make about this, because he's a Yale educated psychiatrist and hasn't really come across this stuff much. But he goes on to explore this much further. And what really surprises him is firstly that after having these experiences where she talks about her past lives, her symptoms start to ease up. And the other thing that surprises him is that at one point, she connects to his deceased father and deceased child and provides him with information that there is no other way that she could have found out. And this kind of puts the whole thing to rest for him, and he sort of starts to believe in it. And when I read this book, I was like, okay, this sounds like reasonable, and it just sort of resonated with me. I didn't really need to question it much more because it kind of just felt right and it felt true, and so I accepted it as true. But as life went on, I found myself having an interesting conversation with my sister probably a couple of years back now, and we were talking about this sort of subject, and there's just no ways that I could convince her that it was true. Not that I was trying hard, but nothing that I said like kind of resonated for her. So I thought I needed to go and do a little bit more digging. So let me just share the screen here and get a presentation up for you. Yeah, there's Dr. Brian Weiss's book. If you haven't read it, it will really blow your world and change things for you. It's really quite remarkable. And I suppose in many ways, the concept of having past lives makes a lot of sense because, well, for those of you with children, you'll realize that your children are born with personalities. They come into this life already like loaded with stuff that there's just no way it could come from anywhere else. And perhaps as you get a bit older, and if you go through some hard times in life, you might realize that, yeah, you can't become so messed up just from one lifetime. But I also had to do some research around where the Western world kind of lost touch with this belief in reincarnation. Because in the East, religions like Hinduism and Buddhism kind of readily accept the concept of reincarnation. In the West, where we come from, the Abrahamic religions, we kind of, our beliefs are kind of formed by Judaism, Islam, or Christianity. And whilst in the sort of more mystical sects of Judaism and Islam, you might find some people who are open to the concept of reincarnation. In Christianity, it's a little bit more difficult. And so I decided to try and find out why this is so. Because if you think about it, the pagan religions from pre-Christian times openly accepted the concept of reincarnation. If you look at the Old Testament and even parts of the New Testament through different eyes, you might even see some evidence for reincarnation in there. And there's a great book called The Reincarnation in the Bible, or is it Reincarnation in the New Testament, that sort of speaks about some of this. But it's a little bit more complicated than that, because Christianity kind of has this dogmatic point of view that says, reincarnation isn't true. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you'll see that it was openly accepted up until about the sort of time of 553 AD, where what happened is the Emperor Justinian, the Roman Empire, took the capital of Rome to Constantinople, which is modern day Istanbul. And what happened is the Catholic Church split. So you had the Western Church with its headquarters in Rome, headed up by Pope Vigilius, and then the Emperor Justinian headed up the Eastern Church, which then became the Orthodox Church in Constantinople. So around the time of 553 AD, the church held its fifth ecumenical council, where they have a meeting of all the bishops and they discuss some of their beliefs and their teachings and so on and so forth. And what happened is, at that meeting, there were 159 bishops from the Eastern Church headed up by Emperor Justinian. And there were 6 bishops who came from the Western Church, including Pope Vigilius. So only 6 bishops. And one of the things discussed at that meeting was the concept of reincarnation. And the emperor didn't want reincarnation to be taught anymore. Pope Vigilius spoke out against it. He boycotted the vote, and he was persecuted, imprisoned, and almost killed for his views. And the rest is history, really. So that's kind of how modern Christianity kind of fell away from a belief in reincarnation. But besides the church, there is a lot more research that has been done on the concept of reincarnation. And one of the forerunners in the West on this research is a guy by the name of Dr. Ian Stevenson. So Dr. Ian Stevenson was a remarkable chap. He finished top of his class. He's enjoying a successful mainstream career with over 60 publications in medical and psychiatric literature to his credit. He was chairman of the departments of psychiatry and neurology at the University of Virginia in 1957. And in 1958, the American Society for Psychical Research held a competition. And it was an essay competition on the topic of paranormal mental phenomena and their relationship to the problem of survival of the human personality after bodily death. Yes, that's a mouthful. Anyway, Dr. Stevenson was quite interested in this, and he had come across a number of cases of people who were remembering their past lives. And for this essay, he analyzed 44 of those cases for a paper, and he won the competition. And what he said was, I couldn't see how they could all be faked or they could all be a deception. So he won that competition, and then a short while later, after that paper was published, he got a call from Eileen Garrett, who was head of the Parapsychology Foundation, and she had heard of a case in India that was quite similar to the cases that Ian had written about. And she offered to pay his expenses to go and investigate that case. So he accepted the offer, and by the time of his trip, he had heard of another 4 or 5 cases in India and another 2 that were in nearby Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka. And by the time he got there, he managed to see 25 cases in India and another 7 cases in Ceylon. On writing more about this, a guy by the name of Chester Carlson He was the guy who invented Xeroxing and founded the Xerox Corporation. He offered to fund Dr. Stevenson's work in this field and later left a big bequest to make it possible for him to work full-time in this field. And obviously, as he started getting into it, he started to become quite intrigued by the sort of things he was discovering. And there were some really, really interesting cases that he discovered. And he's written a number of books, and I've shown a couple of them to you there. His work was continued by Dr. Jim Tucker, who continued the work at the department. And so one of the early cases that he found was a toddler in Sri Lanka who overheard her mother mentioning the name of an obscure town called Kataragama. It was a town that the girl had never been to. And this girl informed her mother that she had drowned there when her mentally challenged brother pushed her into the river. She also said that she had a bald father who sold flowers in a market, and that she lived in a house with a glass window in the roof. And she described a whole number of things about that lifetime. And Dr. Stevenson went and investigated this, and he was a very thorough person who did a lot of interviewing and asked a lot of questions and went and found out as much as he could from the official records. In some cases, he went to look at photographs, if there were photographs of the dead, or he would get information from the autopsy records. In the case of this girl in Sri Lanka, what he found was 27 of the 30 cases were proven. So out of the 30 statements that she made that were verifiable, 27 of those statements were proven to be true. And he managed to get that through the historic records that were available at the time. In another interesting case, the story of James Linninger. He was a young boy who remembered being a World War II fighter pilot. He was the son of a Christian couple in Louisiana, and when he was little, he loved to play with toy planes. But around the time of his second birthday, he started having horrific nightmares 4 or 5 times a week. He had this nightmare of being in a plane crash. And then during the day, he would talk about this plane crash. And he told his parents that he had been a pilot and that he had flown off of a boat. And when his father asked him the name of the boat, he said the boat was called the Natoma. He said that he had been shot down by the Japanese and that he had been killed at Iwo Jima, and that he had a friend on the boat named Jack Larson. And through the research that they did, they actually found out that there was an aircraft carrier called the USS Natoma Bay, stationed in the Pacific during World War II. And in fact, it was involved in the battle there, and it had lost a pilot by the name of James Huston. James Huston's plane had crashed in the way that James Linninger had described, and the plane next to him, the pilot in the plane next to him, was called Jack Larson. And again, a lot of those statements were verified by historical facts that Dr. Ian Stevenson was able to find independently of the family. In another case, a boy by the name of Ryan Hammonds was 4 years old when he began directing imaginary movies, and shouts of action often echoed from his bedroom. But then, shortly after that, he started having night terrors or nightmares, and his doctor just wrote them off. But one night, as his mother was putting him to bed, he suddenly took hold of his mother's hand, and he said, "Mama, I think I used to be somebody else." This obviously was a bit of a surprise for his mother, but he kept recounting these stories of some of his memories, living in a big house with a swimming pool, his life in Hollywood as an actor, and a lot of other statements that he made. And he was quite specific about a lot of things, and he really was missing that lifetime and wanted to have some answers. His mother started doing some research, And they managed to find some pictures from that era. And as they were flicking through the pictures one night, the boy pointed to one of the pictures and identified one of the men in the pictures from 1930s in Hollywood and said, yeah, this is George. They managed to verify a number of other of those cases, a number of the other facts from that case. In one of the other cases, there was a boy who was being changed by his father one night. And as his father was changing his nappy, he looks at his father and he says, when I was your age, I changed your diaper. Father obviously figured must have misheard something. But as the boy made a number of other statements over the next few months, they began to piece a story together. The boy named Sam believed that he was his deceased grandfather. And what was more surprising is when his parents asked him, how did you come back? He said, I just went whoosh and I came out of the portal, he responded. When asked how he had died, he banged his head and shook his head backwards. And what was interesting is his grandfather had actually died of a cerebral hemorrhage a few months previously. In other interesting cases, they have found many examples of where the children had birthmarks that matched the story that they had told. So where there was a case in Thailand where a boy had explained how he had been shot through the back of the head. And he actually had a small birthmark at the back of his head and a larger birthmark at the front of his head. And they've got so many cases where the birthmarks match the records of the autopsy or from photographs or eyewitness accounts from the death of that other person. And these are all documented in Dr. Stevenson's book, Reincarnation and Biology. The question then is, if we can have these birthmarks or physical defects, some of the other defects were missing limbs. There was a girl who was missing the lower part of her legs, and she had described being run over by a train in a previous lifetime. Or a boy who was missing fingers on one of his hands, and he described how he had lost his fingers in a previous lifetime. Is it possible that we can actually have something going on physically or energetically in our current life that has resulted from our experiences in our past lives? As an energy healer, this is what I'm interested in. Obviously, where there's already a physical anomaly or some sort of physical sign, that's great. But a lot of the time, what I'm dealing with is where there is no physical symptom yet, or no physical sign, no physical defect, but there's a symptom that people can't quite understand, or the doctors can't understand. You know, how I came to this work was quite interesting. It kind of started with my daughter. My daughter was an otherwise fit, healthy, and happy young child. But every now and then, she would develop a chest infection. And the one occasion, the chest infection just would not go away. You know, it lasted for a number of weeks. It eventually developed into pneumonia. She had to take some cortisone injections or medication. And she was really in a lot of pain. The doctor was unable to explain why this was happening to her. So he could say, yeah, there's pneumonia, the x-rays on the lung showed some black spots at the bottom of the lungs. But I wanted to know, and my wife wanted to know, why is this happening to her? The next time she started with a chest infection, she started with a cough, I decided to take things a little bit further, and I wanted to find out what the cause was. I was already doing some work as an energy healer, and I kind of had the belief that there's an energetic cause to this. You know, there was no other reason, there's no physical reason for a healthy child to get pneumonia on the lungs. And so I worked with my sort of the healing guides and receiving information from the divine, and just sort of working through going through the symptom, but later also working within the energetic anatomy. And what I found with my daughter is she had a wound on the lungs from a previous lifetime. And what had happened in that lifetime is she had died in a fire. And obviously, dying in the fire, there had been smoke inhalation, and this had damaged the lungs. This had caused a wound on the etheric body of her energy field. So with this work, and my work as an intuitive energy healer, I find it crucial to understand the energetic anatomy. And the energetic anatomy is made up of a few components. There's 5 key components to the energetic anatomy. You've probably heard of the chakras. So there's the primary chakras, secondary chakras, and minor chakras. You've heard of the aura, and the aura is made up of a number of layers. Although they're not really layers, they're more kind of different frequency bands. But it's easier to understand them as layers. So there are a number of layers to the aura. The etheric body is the innermost layer to the aura. And in many ways, it replicates the physical body. So there will be an energetic component to every organ in the body. And it kind of extends, if you're looking at it clairvoyantly, maybe a centimeter or 2 around the outside of a person's physical body. And this is most likely what you see if you're looking at a person with a soft gaze and your eyes get relaxed and you see a little bit of light around their head or around their body. Or perhaps if you're looking at a tree with a soft gaze, you might see the etheric body of the tree. So the etheric body is where I found this wound on my daughter. The other parts of the energetic anatomy are the meridians, primary, secondary, and of course they're the nadis. And then there are energy channels and there are energy centers. So the most notable energy channel that I would refer to is the Kundalini channel. There's also an important one called the communication channel, and a few other energy channels to be aware of. And then there are a couple of energy centers that are important. The most important energy center, in my view, is the heart center or the heart field. And I would also say the lower Kundalini center or the Alta Major is the upper Kundalini center are important energy centers. But there are a couple of other ones around the energetic anatomy. Now, let me just share the screen again and bring something else up for you. So here's a diagram showing the layers of the aura and the primary chakras. And depending on the school of thought, the layers of the aura will have different names. So different spiritual teachers will give the layers of the aura different names, but you can actually, for simplification purposes, just call them layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, and so on. And these go out for several thousand layers. And what I find is the further out in the energy field you go, in many cases, the further back in time the energetic blockage will be, except in the case of the wounds on the etheric body. When it comes to the energetic anatomy, what's important to understand is how these blockages are how they actually get stuck in the energy body. So say, for example, you get upset with your father and you're 13 years old and you get very angry, and that emotion isn't processed, perhaps it's suppressed or denied. That energetic charge can get stuck somewhere in the energetic anatomy. It's pretty complicated, and I'm not quite sure if I understand how and why it gets stuck in different places, but it kind of depends on what the subject is, what the reason for that upset is. So it could get stuck in one of the layers of the aura, one of the chakras, according to the function of the chakra. So let's say, for example, you're upset with your father about some control issues or trying to step into your power and he's stepping you back. That might get stuck in the solar plexus chakra, which is about your personal power. But it might also get stuck in your emotional body, which processes a lot of our current life emotions. And this would appear perhaps just like a black cloud in that part of the aura. These blockages can stay stuck there until they are released intentionally or through some spiritual work, or just they might just simply dissolve over time. But it might take several lifetimes for this blockage to dissolve. And what seems to happen is through the lifetimes, they move further out in the energy field. So besides the emotional blockages that get stuck in the energy field, there are a number of other types of blockages that can also occur. These could be energetic wounds. So what I was describing with my daughter was an energetic wound that was formed on the etheric body from a past life physical trauma. Now, most etheric wounds I come across are created by past life physical trauma. Sometimes it could be caused by a current life physical trauma, and on rare occasions it has been an intense emotional event that has caused a disturbance in that part of the energy field. There are a couple of other types of blockages that can occur in the energy field, such as thought forms, which are normally past life events that I normally find in the mental body. So a thought form is kind of like a snapshot of a past traumatic event. So say, for example, somebody was stabbed in their back by a knife in a past life. The thought form would appear psychically as a knife in the back. And until that knife is removed, a sensitive person will feel a discomfort in that area of their body and would not be able to understand what is causing it. One of the common ones I come across is a rope around the neck where people have been hung in a past life. And as you tune into this energy and you look at it clairvoyantly, you might actually see a rope around the person's neck and going up through the energy field. And what people report is a tightness around the throat, perhaps a sore throat that occurs often. You know, there might be a weakness there. That means that when that person comes down with a cold, it often goes to the throat. They might have communication blocks. And it can get quite complicated because in many cases, there are often a number of layers of blockage or wound. So in the case of somebody having a rope around their neck, they might also have a corresponding etheric wound on the etheric body, also on the neck. Okay. The other thing that occurs in the mental body is what I call shadow aspects, but these are kind of like emotional blockages that are formed there, in a similar process to what I described in the example of where a child might get upset with their father. So this is kind of like a shadow that one might see or sense in that part of the energy field. The work on the etheric body and the wounds on the etheric body are more interesting because these take a lot more effort to heal, because the etheric body is much closer to the physical body. It takes more effort, and there's a specific process to heal those wounds on that part of the energy field. So I gave you the example of my daughter who had the wound on her lungs. In another example on the etheric body, one that was perhaps had quite an easy success. My wife had a person who was helping her at work, and she was a shop assistant, a shop sales assistant at one of the shops that my wife was dealing with. And one day she explained to my wife how she had to leave her job to go and look after the young child because the young child was very sickly. So the child was younger than the age of 1, and for 6 months had not left the house, because every time this child left the house, they would get sick. They'd get a rash on their skin, they'd get allergies, snotty nose, tight chest, etc. So they just really had quite a weak constitution and were unable to leave the house for fear of getting sick. And because of the cost of childcare, this mother kind of had to leave her job to go and care for the child. And my wife came to me after that conversation and asked me if I would help this child. And I said, yes, of course I would. And a couple of days later, I had the opportunity to do the work, and I connected to the energy. tuned into the energy. And what I discovered was this child had been a soldier in World War II and had died from a hand grenade blast. And the hand grenade, the shrapnel from the hand grenade, had damaged the entire etheric body. So the etheric wound wasn't located in any specific part of the body, but it covered the entire etheric body. So I did the healing. There wasn't much else to do for this child except for this etheric healing. And a couple of days later, my wife followed up with a phone call to this lady, and she was so grateful and so amazed because of the transformation that had taken place in her child. A few weeks later, this lady was back at work because the child had healed so much that the child was then able to live a normal life once again. Things are normally a lot more complicated than that, though. It normally takes a bit more work to heal things, because for most people, the energetic damage and the energetic blockages are on a number of levels. And also, when working with adults, it's a bit more complicated because adults kind of have a limiting belief problem where they kind of sometimes don't heal as fast as they should because they don't believe that it's possible. Working with children and animals is wonderful because you sort out the energy and the behavior changes or the physical symptom changes quite simply, quite straightforward. In another interesting case I had with an adult, it was somebody with cancer, and they also had their leg in a cast at the time. So I had to go and do a house visit. And because I was doing a house visit, I did the preparation before leaving my home. So I knew very little about the case at the time. She had asked me to come and see her. I did the preparation, and what I found was a couple of wounds on the etheric body. The most notable was a wound on the side of the head. And the image that I got as I connected to that wound psychically was, I got the image of a battle, a Native American battle, and she had been killed with an axe to the head. And around that wound, there are a number of other energetic blockages in the other layers of the energy field. You can imagine my surprise when I get to her house and we start having a discussion, and immediately I can see what she's going to tell me because her eye is all swollen. The eye is all swollen, the whole side of her face. And she gets to telling me that there was a tumor, and the tumor was growing at the back of her head, at the back of the eye. And so I showed her the diagram that I had drawn of her energy field. And I said, well, this is kind of where all the energetic problem is. There's the axe wound. And I explained what had happened, and she was quite surprised by all of that. And we did a lot of healing through a number of sessions, because in the other layers of the energy field, there's a lot of other stuff and a lot of anger towards her father, and it gets complicated. But I find it quite interesting that in a number of cases where a client has a tumor, the tumor starts growing at the point where there is an etheric wound like this. There were a few other cases similar to that. And for a period of time, I had a number of clients who had wounds from battles, arrows that might have been shot into them, and thought forms of the arrow in the back, etc., etc. One of the other interesting cases I had was, again, with a child. The parents contacted me because the child had, I can't remember exactly, but there was a liquid on the brain. And they asked me to take a look at what was going on with the liquid on the brain. There had been some wound on the brain, and I can't remember the details, but what really was surprising with this case is, what I found is the child had been stabbed in the stomach, below the belly button, with a knife in a previous lifetime. And in that lifetime, they had been stabbed by their brother in a dispute over land or inheritance or something, or there was some story about that. And so after having the discussion with the mother about the head, I asked the mother if the child had a birthmark below the belly button, or if the child was having any sort of digestive issues in that area. And what she said was, when the child was born, the child actually had a rare condition where the stomach was on the outside and it was below the belly button. And as soon as that child was born, they had to do an operation to get the stomach back on the inside. So that was like really, really quite profound. And it's, really got me thinking about the importance of some of this work and how important it is as healers that we learn how to do this. Let me just share another slide with you. I want to talk about the heart field. Now, I mentioned earlier that the heart field is an important part of the energetic anatomy. The heart field is the other area where I find a lot of past life trauma. Now, the etheric body kind of holds wounds from past life physical trauma. Where there was a physical trauma, that is held in the etheric body, the innermost layer of the aura. The heart field is kind of an important field of energy that sort of radiates around our heart center. What I kind of see as the soul, or the center point of the soul. The trauma that I find here is more emotional in nature. Now, the first time I started working on my own energy field in the heart, my own heart field, was very interesting. I'd spent a number of days clearing blockages in the heart field. And I was kind of monitoring my heart frequency, which is kind of like a kind of number that I use as a key performance indicator, something that I use to sort of check my work. And I was noticing my heart frequency was rising with each blockage that I cleared. And I noticed that I was getting closer and closer to the finish point of the clearing, because the heart frequency was getting very close to the optimum frequency. And when I got to the final blockage in the heart field, and I connected to this energy, I was taken to this past life experience. And it was a past life experience where my parents had died. My parents had died in a fire. I had survived, and I had felt a lot of guilt and shame and grief around their death. And in that lifetime, I was 12 years old when they died, and they happened to be my same parents from my current lifetime. And as this information flowed into my consciousness, I just broke down in tears as the energy and the emotion from this trauma was finally released. I cried for a few minutes. I can't remember exactly. And afterwards, I just sort of like felt so much lighter and so much more energized. But the most interesting thing was, at the time, I still had a business. I had an importing business, and I'd been waiting on a big purchase order from a client. And almost as a sign from the universe, the next day, this purchase order arrived. And I'd been waiting for months. I'd been waiting for months and months and months for this purchase order. They'd been telling me it was coming, promised it was on its way. The next morning, I got the email, the purchase order had gone through. And what I found in my work with the heart field is when this energy channel, when the heart energy is opened up, the flow of life seems to increase. Everything, all this divine energy that comes through us, comes through the heart. And when we can get this energy flowing, life seems to fall into place. Now, these days, I use a much more efficient process to clear the heart field. And this process is called the soul retrieval. The soul retrieval is essentially about going back in time to heal and recover a part of the soul that's been lost or damaged. So the soul retrieval term is a shamanic term. There are a number of ways that healers can do a soul retrieval. There's the shamanic method where the shaman goes back in time and does the healing and brings the soul back for you. I've also been trained in a process called timeline therapy, which is kind of does the process, but without using any spiritual or esoteric language. And you kind of go back in time and you can guide your client to that point in time to do the healing. And there are variations of these processes that one can use depending on who you're working with and so on. So for example, if I was working with a child or an animal, I wouldn't take them on a guided meditation to do the healing themselves. I would go and do the process for them. But my preferred method is to do a guided meditation. And I've had some really interesting experiences doing this. One of the most interesting ones took place with somebody who was a Muslim and didn't really believe in reincarnation and past lives. She said she was kind of okay with it, but didn't really believe in it and didn't really know what to make of it. But what the problem that she was struggling with was anxiety. She had this sort of like anxiety that was ever present and sort of heightened at times. And we did this process and she started describing to me a scene. And in this scene, she found herself in a basement, locked in a dark basement, and through the floorboards above her, she could hear an altercation taking place. Through the cracks in the floorboard, she could see kind of shadows, a couple of figures there. And there was a man and a woman. And there was an altercation taking place. And what happened was the man killed the woman. And the girl in the basement was hiding away and hoping she wouldn't be discovered. So we did the healing. She noticed a notable reduction in the anxiety that she had been feeling. In another case that was interesting, we went back in time to a lifetime where, as a young girl growing up in poverty, in that lifetime, she had to go and work in the coal mines in Wales. And as a young girl working in the coal mines, she was subjected to frequent sexual abuse. And as we tried to heal that trauma, we were guided that we had to heal a subsequent trauma, and we had to heal the sexual abuse that had taken place in the current life. And this case was quite interesting because as we healed the trauma from the various different lifetimes that had some emotional impact in the current life, such as claustrophobia from being in closed spaces, there was also an etheric wound that was in the etheric body around the reproductive organs that had resulted in well, I'm not sure if it resulted in that, but the client had had a hysterectomy in this lifetime. There's the etheric wound from the physical trauma in the past lives. There was the soul loss from the emotional trauma, and there were some symptoms in the current life relating to the claustrophobia and being in small spaces and so on. So it can get very, very complicated when dealing with past life trauma. Often the trauma is reflected in current life issues, because one of the signs and when a trauma is being pushed up to the surface for healing, what happens is the emotion from that trauma kind of gets pushed up to the surface. So whether it's fear or anxiety, or perhaps it's depression, one kind of experiences the emotions without kind of really knowing where the emotions come from. Okay, when it comes to the sort of past life physical trauma in the etheric body, often there's like a physical symptom. People can feel something. You know, in one case I found the client had died in a fire, and in the fire her arms especially had been damaged. And when I was explaining this to her, she explained that she always had a burning sensation on her arms, on her forearms, and she was unable to explain the burning sensation on her arms, but that subsided after the healing on the etheric body had taken place. So these are some of the more severe past life traumas that people can experience. Okay, and these blockages in the energy field mostly need special attention. You kind of need to identify them. You need to identify where they are in the energetic anatomy. You need to identify some of the information around that wound to kind of understand it and release it. But there can also be a number of smaller blockages in the energy field. So say, for example, in part of the aura, perhaps in your emotional body or your mental body, there will also be a number of blockages that aren't so severe. Sort of, perhaps we could call them minor blockages. And the minor blockages can actually be released through directed breath work, using your intention and your visualization to breathe divine light through a certain part of your energy field. And by doing this on a regular basis, you'll find that you might be able to release a lot of the minor blockages in that energy field. So in the past, where I've actually, before I discovered this, I would go through the process of releasing each blockage one at a time. And I typically found there would be between 40 and 60 blockages in a particular part of the energetic anatomy. These days, I find that one can release perhaps up to 20 of the minor blockages in a go just by directing divine energy with intention and breath through that part of the energy field. Most people seem to have a handful of more severe blockages in different parts of the energy field that need sort of specific attention, that you kind of need to connect to and breathe light through. Okay. The next part of the energetic anatomy that I just want to touch on before going to questions is the extended light body. Now, when I refer to the extended light body, I kind of refer to layers 6 to 16 of the energy field. Let me just share another slide quickly. When I work on the aura, I kind of work on the lower 5 levels, and then layer 6 to 16 is what I would call the extended light body. Now, there can be blockages, and there are frequently blockages in the extended light body that can be released fairly easily just through directed intention and channeling divine light into that part of the energy field. There's also something else in the extended light body, and this is what I call the aspects of the extended light body. Now, if you look at the layers of your energy field, perhaps as layers of an onion, and each layer of the energy field kind of radiates outwards at a slightly higher frequency. So they're not really layers, but they're more frequency bands that also radiate out from the center. The aspects of the extended light body are more like segments of a nachi. And if you're not South African, a nachi is kind of like a South African satsuma. So the layers of the nachi are kind of like radiate around the extended light body and permeate through the layers. So they go through a number of layers and all around the energy field. And even though I'm kind of using words to try and describe something that isn't visible and isn't physical, it's kind of like a metaphorical explanation of what the aspects of the extended light body are. The aspects of the extended light body contain the debris of all sort of past life trauma. The sort of minor blockages, the blockages that aren't so severe that they need individual attention, but they kind of clog up the energetic anatomy. They clog up that part of the energy field and they hamper the flow of energy through the energy body. There's 17 aspects in the extended light body. And the aspects cover subjects such as a family, partner, sexuality, money, finances, siblings, children, parents. And in each of these aspects, we'll find blockages that relate to our relationships to these people or to these subjects throughout our past lives on earth, throughout all our incarnations. And all the stuck emotional energy, the anger, the sadness, the bitterness, the despair kind of gets stuck in there. So whilst we've certainly got those emotions stuck in the emotional body and the mental body and the other layers of the energy field, there's a lot of past life stuff in the aspects of the energetic anatomy. That kind of summarizes where the blockages are, where the past life blockages are within the energetic anatomy. A lot of it you'll be able to clear through your own efforts, through directed breath work through the energy field, through visualization and intention, and some of it will take a little bit more work. Yeah, and that's kind of it. Let me see, have I forgotten anything? I wanted to show you some of the research that Dr. Ian Stevens and Dr. Tucker found. I'm just going to go back to that slide because I missed it earlier. So in their research, they found that 60% of the children who claim past life memories are male. 70% of those children claim they had died from a violent or an unnatural death. Which they say is similar to the general population. And what I think that means is violent or unnatural deaths occur 70% of the time in males. 90% of the time, the children say they were the same sex in the previous lifetime as they are in now. And the median time between the claimed death and birth is 16 months. Okay, and most of the time, these memories occur between the age of 2 and 6 years old. And this kind of resonates true with me because my daughter often spoke of her previous house or from before. She'd make these vague statements that my wife and I didn't quite understand, but we kind of figured she's probably talking about a past life. But she didn't have very clear memories, but there's certainly something between those ages, between the age of 2 and 6. So yeah, I just thought that was quite interesting.
Thank you, Mark. That was fascinating, a subject close to my heart, and I myself have healed a number of traumas going through my life by doing some past life work. So for me, I know it works, and I think what is important that it always relates to something that we're going through at that time.